On the night of August 8, 1942, Gunichi Mikawa stood on the bridge of his flagship Chokai and watched 4 Allied heavy cruisers sink. He had 7 cruisers and a destroyer. He lost none of them in 33 minutes. 4 Allied warships on the bottom of Iron Bottom Sound, 2 more badly damaged. More than 1,000 American and Australian sailors dead. Mikawa's force, intact, disappeared into the darkness before a single Allied aircraft found them. Yamamoto sent a congratulatory telegram before sunrise. Here is the part nobody tells. 3 days later, the airfield Mikawa's mission had been designed to stop became operational. Planes that took off from it spent the next 6 months making it impossible for Japan to supply its soldiers on Guadalcanal. Those soldiers starved. The campaign lasted 6 months and consumed 2 Japanese battleships, dozens of other warships, and over 20,000 lives. Mikawa won the greatest tactical surface victory of the entire Pacific War, and he lost the campaign in the same 33 minutes. Before we go on, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if you're loving this story, subscribe, because tomorrow we have something extra special waiting for you. His full name was Gunichi Mikawa, and before August 1942, he had spent 4 decades becoming exactly the kind of officer the Imperial Japanese Navy built its reputation on. He graduated from the Naval Academy at Edajima 3rd in his class, not 1st, 3rd. In a Navy where class rank followed an officer his entire career, that distinction mattered. It meant something at every promotion board, every command assignment, every time his name came up in conversation at Naval General Headquarters. 3rd meant brilliant. It also meant there were 2 men above him who on paper outranked him in the quiet hierarchy of institutional prestige. He spent years teaching at the academy before rising to fleet command. He had read Mahan's The Influence of Sea Power upon history 4 times, not as an academic exercise. As a practicing officer who believed that understanding naval strategy at its foundations was the difference between a commander who reacted and one who shaped events. He was methodical, patient, and precise in a Navy that trained its officers to be aggressive to the point of recklessness. When the Pacific War began in December 1941, Mikawa commanded a battleship division at Pearl Harbor and later during the Dutch East Indies campaign. He was not, by the summer of 1942, a man who needed to prove himself. He had the record and the decorations and the respect of officers who had served with him across 20 years of sea postings. What he did not have in August of 1942 was a plan that matched the actual strategic problem he had been sent to solve. That gap between the plan he was given and the problem that needed solving is the whole story. To understand Savo Island, you need to understand what August 7th, 1942 looked like from the Japanese side. The Americans had landed on Guadalcanal. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, less than 2 months after Midway, the Marine Corps had put 16,000 men on an island Japan was using to build an airfield. An airfield that, once finished, would give Japanese air power the range to threaten Allied supply lines all the way to Australia. The Americans had not only taken the island, they had taken the half-finished airfield. Yamamoto understood the problem with a clarity most of his subordinates didn't share. He had lived in America. He had watched American shipyards from the inside. He knew what the United States could build once it decided to start building. And he knew that every week the Americans held Guadalcanal was a week closer to the moment when industrial output would make the outcome of the Pacific War a foregone conclusion. The window for Japan to win was not wide. It was closing. His solution: send the Navy, destroy the transports. If the supplies and ammunition never made it onto the beach, the Marines already ashore would be holding a patch of jungle with what they could carry. Mikawa was the man Yamamoto chose. He received his orders at Rabaul on August 6th, spent 1 day planning, assembled 7 cruisers and a destroyer, and headed south down the passage. American aircrew would soon name the slot. The planning took less than 24 hours that is worth sitting with. Mikawa had 1 day to design and execute a night attack against a force of unknown composition, protecting an anchorage he had never seen in waters with no reliable charts against an enemy who had radar and had been warned that morning that a Japanese column was moving south. He pulled it off. The Allies made it easier than it should have been. The warning report sat in the wrong inbox. The screening force was split into 3 separate groups with no unified command. The radar operators, exhausted from 2 days of air attacks, had their sets angled for aircraft, not ships. Mikawa's column swept through all of it. Southern group first, then northern, then a second pass. First shot to cease fire, 33 minutes, USS Astoria, USS Quincy, USS Vincennes, Mascambra, gone. 2 more ships damaged and fleeing. 1 Japanese vessel hit, none sunk. Richard Frank, who wrote the definitive history of the Guadalcanal campaign, called Savo Island the worst defeat the United States Navy ever suffered in a fair fight. Not Pearl Harbor, which was a surprise. Savo Island, where both sides knew the other was there. At 2:16 in the morning, Mikawa stood on the bridge of Chokai and looked at what he had. His force was intact. The Allied screening force was gone. The American transports were 12 miles away. 16,000 Marine had not finished unloading. Supplies, the ammunition, the artillery pieces, the aviation fuel, the spare parts for the aircraft that would fly from the runway they had just taken, all of it was still in those ships or barely on the beach. He had officers on the bridge who wanted to go after the transports. The path was open. He called a staff meeting at 2:16 a.m. What followed was not a moment of cowardice. It was a moment of careful, precise, professional calculation that happened to be based on one critical piece of information that Mikawa did not have. The calculation. His force had been in action for half an hour. His ships were scattered over several miles of water and would need 30 minutes to regroup. The transports were 12 miles away. By the time he regrouped and reached them, he would be in those waters at or near first light. American carriers were in the area. In daylight, with no air cover of his own, his cruisers would be sitting in open water, and the carrier aircraft would find them. So, he ordered the withdrawal. What Mikawa did not know. The American carrier task force had already left. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, citing fuel concerns and the losses his air groups had taken over the previous 2 days, had pulled his carriers south hours earlier. By 2:16 a.m., when Mikawa was standing on that bridge doing the math, the threat he was calculating against had already steamed away. The sky over those transports would have been empty. This is the detail that historians have argued about ever since. Should Mikawa have known? Could he have known? The carriers had been operating under strict radio silence. His reconnaissance was incomplete. The calculation he made was, with the information he had, defensible. The transports he left untouched would spend the next week offloading the supplies that kept the Marines on Guadalcanal alive. Henderson Field became operational on August 20th, 11 days after the Battle of Savo Island. From that morning forward, every Japanese ship that tried to operate in those waters in daylight-faced aircraft, from the runway that Mikawa had been close enough to destroy. Yamamoto's telegram praised the victory. The telegram did not mention the transports. That omission is not a small thing. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The entire purpose of sending Mikawa south was to sever the Allied supply line to Guadalcanal. His operational orders said nothing about engaging and defeating Allied warships in a fleet action. Warships were a screening force protecting the transports. They were the obstacle, not the objective. Mikawa had destroyed the obstacle and left the objective intact, and he had been congratulated for it. This is the organizational failure that the victory telegram covered over. Not Mikawa's decision in isolation, but what the telegram meant about how the system understood what had happened. A victory had been won. The mission had been accomplished. The operational orders had been satisfied. Nobody in the chain of command from Mikawa to Yamamoto to the Naval General Staff seems to have sat down in the first 48 hours after Savo Island and asked the obvious question, does the enemy still hold Henderson Field? The answer was yes, and they had just cleared the road to it. Captain Toshikazu Omai, Mikawa's operations officer, wrote after the war that the decision to withdraw was discussed on the bridge and that the consensus was that the carrier threat was real and that daylight in unprotected waters was unacceptable. He also wrote in the same memoir that in retrospect, the transport should have been attacked. He wrote this as if it were a minor tactical footnote rather than the central fact about the whole battle. Samuel Eliot Morison, the American naval historian who wrote the definitive multi-volume history of the U.S. Navy in World War II, was considerably less measured. He wrote that Mikawa had handed the Americans a victory they had not earned, and could not have earned on the battlefield that night. The Japanese historians who examined the battle were harder still, writing in the 1950s, called the decision to withdraw one of the most consequential command failures of the entire Pacific War. Not because Mikawa was wrong about the carrier threat, because the question of what to do if you destroy the screening force and the transports are still there had never been asked before the ships left Rabaul. The possibility was not in the plan because the plan did not look past the night action. Yamamoto relieved Mikawa of command at the 8th Fleet approximately 3 months after Savo Island. The official reason was to rotate command and bring in fresh leadership for the next phase of the Guadalcanal campaign. That was true as far as it went. What it did not capture was the quieter institutional reality, which was that Mikawa had used up his credibility. He had won a battle and lost the context of the battle. In a navy where your class rank and your previous commands followed you everywhere, there was a particular kind of failure that was harder to survive than outright defeat. Defeat could be explained. Defeat could be attributed to material inferiority, or enemy luck or weather. But winning a battle and still watching the campaign go wrong, watching the airfield you were supposed to destroy grind your surface forces down ship by ship over 6 months, that was a different kind of failure. It didn't have a clean name. It didn't fit the categories. His next commands were not nothing. He served as commander of the Southwest Area Fleet based at Manila, a substantial assignment on paper. But he was never again given independent command of a surface force, in the kind of critical engagement where the outcome of a campaign would hinge on what he decided. The implicit judgment of his superiors was never stated directly, because the Imperial Japanese Navy was not an institution that stated its implicit judgments directly. It was an institution that reassigned people. He survived the war. He was 71 when he died in 1981 in Japan. He gave interviews in his later years to historians and journalists who wanted to understand what he had been thinking on that bridge at 2:16 in the morning. He was consistent. He had assessed the threat. He had made the decision his training and his experience told him to make. He had done what a professional naval officer in his position was supposed to do. He was not wrong about any of that. He was also not wrong that the transports should have been attacked. He lived with both of those things for 39 years. Here is the question Savo Island keeps raising, that the after-action reports never answered. What was the mission? Not what the orders said. The orders said, proceed south, disrupt the invasion, engage the enemy. Every checkbox was checked. But what was the campaign trying to accomplish? Keep Henderson Field from becoming operational. Keep the Americans from establishing a base in the lower Solomons that would let them cut off Rabaul. The Battle of Savo Island accomplished none of that. The most comprehensive tactical victory the Imperial Japanese Navy would win in the entire Pacific War accomplished none of that. Because the mission handed to Mikawa, defeat the Allied screening force, was not the same mission as the campaign objective. That gap was not Mikawa's failure. It was the system's. He did exactly what he was sent to do. The system sent him to win a night battle when what was actually needed was to destroy a supply operation. The distinction never made it into the debrief at Rabaul. There is a detail that tends to get mentioned and passed over. When Mikawa's column made its second pass through the anchorage, his lookouts could see the sinking ships burning on the water. His flag officer noted in the log that the anchorage where the transports were anchored was lit by the glow of the burning warships. The transports were illuminated. Mikawa could see them from where he was. He ordered the withdrawal anyway. History keeps the names of the admirals, the class rankings, the congratulatory telegrams. The men who stood on those bridges, watched the fires, and turned north have mostly been silent about it ever since. For the obvious reason. The USS Quincy went down in about 25 minutes after being hit, her hull so heavily damaged that she capsized and sank still firing her guns. Her commanding officer, Captain Samuel Moore, was killed on the bridge early in the engagement. The gunnery officer, taking command in the last minutes, continued directing fire until the ship went under. The survivors, many of them burned, spent several hours in shark-infested water before rescue ships arrived in the morning. Of the Quincy's crew, 370 men died. This is mentioned not to establish Allied heroism, though it was that. It is mentioned because the ships on both sides of that night represent something that tends to get abstracted away in the historical discussion of Mikawa's withdrawal decision. The argument about whether he should have turned back for the transports, at its core, an argument about strategic calculation, about opportunity costs and carrier threats and daylight windows. That argument is worth having. Historians have been having it for 80 years and will continue to have it. But the men who went down with the Quincy and the Vincennes and the Astoria and 8 Canberra went down because of a Japanese tactical success that did not, in the end, accomplish what the Japanese needed it to accomplish. The sacrifice on the Allied side produced Henderson Field. The sacrifice on the Japanese side, and there was Japanese sacrifice at Savo Island, the Kinugasa was hit. Men died on every ship that came through that anchorage under fire, produced a victory telegram and a subsequent 6 months of catastrophe. That is the thing that the congratulatory telegram from Yamamoto papered over. The victory was real. The victory was also, in the context of what came next, almost meaningless. Retired Vice Admiral Raizo Tanaka, who spent the months after Savo Island running the Tokyo Express, the desperate high-speed destroyer runs down the slot that tried to supply the starving Japanese garrison on Guadalcanal, wrote a memoir after the war that was unusually candid about the institutional failures that led to Guadalcanal becoming a catastrophe. He wrote that Savo Island should have been studied more carefully, not as a tactical success, but as a case study in what happens when you win the battle you were sent to fight and lose the campaign you were sent to win. His memoir was not widely circulated within the Japanese naval establishment. The officers who needed to read it were not, by the time it was written, in positions where reading it would have changed anything. The war was over. The Navy was gone. Rabaul was a memory. Tanaka wrote, late in his life, that the decision Mikawa made at 2:16 in the morning was a decision that any well-trained Japanese naval officer would have made. The training said, preserve the fleet, get the ships home, fight another day. It was the same instinct that Abe would have months later after winning his night battle and finding the path to Henderson Field open and choosing to withdraw. It was the same instinct that ran through the entire surface warfare doctrine of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The doctrine was not wrong. The doctrine had been built on decades of careful study and practice and tactical innovation. The long lance torpedo was night fighting techniques that outmatched anything the Allies had in 1942. Surface gunnery, trained to standards that American gunnery would not match until late in the war. The doctrine was built for a different kind of war. It was built for a war where winning a night engagement was decisive, where destroying the enemy's screening force ended the threat, where the tactical victory and the strategic victory were the same thing. Guadalcanal was not that kind of war. At Guadalcanal, you could win every night battle and still lose the campaign, because the campaign was not about who controlled the water at 2:01 in the morning. Campaign was about who controlled the air during the day, and air control was determined by who controlled the runway, and the runway was determined by who could supply and reinforce the garrison, and the garrison was determined by whether those transports had been sunk on the night of August 8th. Mikawa's 33-minute tactical masterpiece left the transports untouched. The doctrine never told him what to do next. There is a piece of paper in the U.S. National Archives, a damage assessment written at Rabaul on August 12, 1942, 4 days after Savo Island. It lists the ships sunk, the ships damaged, the estimated casualties on both sides. At the bottom, a section headed Status of Enemy Airfield. The entry reads, Operational Status Unknown. Aerial Reconnaissance Pending. That sentence is the whole story. 4 days after the greatest Japanese surface victory of the Pacific War, the staff at Rabaul did not know whether the airfield they had been trying to stop was working. The reconnaissance hadn't happened. The result of the battle, in terms of what it actually meant for the campaign, was literally unknown. Henderson Field became operational on August 20th, 8 days after that document was written. The reconnaissance, when it finally came, found an airfield with planes on it. Mikawa spent the autumn commanding the 8th Fleet in a role that grew increasingly reactive. Supply operations, surface coordination, all of it adding up to the same problem. The campaign was being lost because Henderson Field could not be neutralized by one-night raids, which was the only tool Japanese surface doctrine had. In November, Yamamoto sent Abe into Iron Bottom Sound with battleships to finish what Mikawa's cruisers hadn't. Mikawa watched from Rabaul as Abe's flagship went in circles, got scuttled by its own destroyers, and sank in the same water where Mikawa had fought 3 months earlier. He watched Kondo go in the following night and lose the second battleship to Washington's radar-controlled guns. He was transferred out of the 8th Fleet Command before the year was out. In an interview decades later, he said the thing he had thought about most wasn't the decision at 2:16 in the morning. He had made that decision for reasons he still believed were sound. What he thought about was the planning meeting at Rabaul on August 6th, the night before he sailed. He had planned the route, the attack formation, the withdrawal course, every phase. He had not thought about what happened if he completed the night attack and the transports were still there. The possibility had not been in the plan. The planning meeting had not asked for it. Question that is not asked, he said, cannot be answered. In the spring of 1943, with the Guadalcanal campaign over and Japan evacuated from the island, the senior staff at Imperial General Headquarters conducted a formal review of the campaign's failures. Mikawa was not present for that review. In the spring of 1943, with Guadalcanal evacuated, the senior staff at Imperial General Headquarters conducted a formal review of the campaign's failures. Mikawa's name appears in those documents not as a person who failed, but as a person who won. The Battle of Savo Island is listed as a Japanese tactical success. The review notes that despite this success, subsequent operations failed to capitalize on the conditions created. Reasons given: material inferiority, supply difficulties, American air superiority. Not one line connects Savo Island to the operational context of the campaign. Not one line asks whether winning the battle and leaving the transports intact was, in strategic terms, equivalent to losing. The institutional vocabulary simply did not include that kind of question about a victory. A document that could have asked it existed. Kawaguchi had written it 6 weeks after Savo Island, from a hospital bed, after being relieved of command for the crime of putting accurate facts in an official report. His after-action analysis had questioned, in fairly direct terms, whether Japanese operational doctrine was matched to the kind of war being fought. It had been filed, classified, not distributed. The staff review was conducted without it. They reached the same conclusions they would have reached without it. Mikawa's record showed a victory. There is a piece of business that appears at the end of almost every account of Savo Island that misidentifies what the battle was actually about. The standard framing goes, Mikawa made a defensible decision based on incomplete intelligence. He couldn't have known the carriers had left. His calculation was reasonable. The decision not to attack the transports was therefore understandable, if costly. That framing is correct as far as it goes. But it frames the story as a story about the 2:16 a.m. decision. And the 2:16 a.m. decision was not the failure. The failure was at Rabaul on August 6th. At the planning meeting, no one in that room had written into the operational plan a course of action for the scenario that actually occurred. Japanese surface force destroys Allied screening force. Allied transports remain in the anchorage. Daylight is approaching. What do we do? The plan had no answer because no one had asked the question. Mikawa arrived at 2:16 a.m. with no doctrine and no orders covering the situation he was actually in. He made the best decision he could with what he had. That is not a compliment. It is a description of a systemic failure that repeated itself across the entire Guadalcanal campaign. From the Ichiki detachment in August to Hyakutaki's 20,000-man offensive in October. The Japanese military in 1942 was extraordinarily capable of executing plans that matched their doctrine. They were institutionally incapable of asking whether the plan matched the actual problem. Mikawa went to Savo Island with the right ships, the right training, the right tactics, and the wrong question. He won 33 minutes of brilliance. He lost the campaign before sunrise. Robert Ballard found the wrecks in 1992. The Astoria, the Quincy, the Vincennes, the Canberra, all on the bottom of Iron Bottom Sound, within a few miles of each other, settled into the mud in the dark. The airfield they were supposed to protect is right there above them. Henderson Field is now Honiara International Airport. Cargo flights in the morning, charter planes in the afternoon. The terminal has air conditioning and a duty-free shop. The sound is quiet in a way that only sounds that have seen that much can be. Gunichi Mikawa died in 1981 in his home in Japan. He was 80 years old. Had outlived most of the officers who served under him, most of the officers he served under, and the Navy he spent his life in. His obituaries noted the Battle of Savo Island. They noted the victory. Most noted in passing the withdrawal. None of them quite had language for what it means to execute a plan perfectly and still lose the campaign it was designed to win. Mikawa knew what it meant. He had 39 years to think about it. The transports he left untouched are gone now, worn to rust somewhere in those waters or broken on Pacific coral. The runway they supplied is still there. That's our story. If you enjoyed it, hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell. And tomorrow, more stories are waiting for you. Thanks for watching.